The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's a really great piece by Paul Krugman in the New York Times boiling down sort of one of the scariest elements of the Donald Trump candidacy. And it's not about any specific policy, but it's the idea that Donald Trump seems to increasingly think that he really could be the president, that he's really competent enough to actually do the job. We've spoken about the reality. It's no surprise that low information voters, people who claim to want to buck the establishment, and some others have been sort of bamboozled into supporting Donald Trump for different reasons, right? Different people for different reasons. We see that all the time. We see voters, especially Republicans, vote for truly incompetent candidates all the time. We see them vote for candidates who actually would push policies that are against their own best interests. That's not the rare or unusual thing. But Paul Krugman points out that the real danger is that Donald Trump might actually think he would make a good president, and that's a really scary thing. There are elements of Mitt Romney's candidacy in all this. Let's sort of break it down. First, Paul Krugman wrote in his New York Times article, granted, most voters probably don't know anything about Trump's policy pronouncements, in part thanks to substance-free news coverage. But if voters don't know anything about Mr. Trump's policies, why their favorable impression of his economic management skills? The answer, I suspect, is that voters see Mr. Trump as a hugely successful businessman and believe that that business success translates into economic expertise. They are, however, probably wrong about the first and definitely wrong about the second. Even genuinely brilliant business people are often clueless about economic policy. So there's two sides to this. First of all, there's this general idea that good business people make good presidents. We went through this with Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney ran on that idea. There is no evidence to back that up. And I asked this of so many Republican strategists 4 years ago, what evidence can you point to that good business people or even business people make good presidents? And there is none. That's number one. Now, I'm the first person to tell you we need politicians from more diverse backgrounds, science, education, etc. Why do we have predominantly just lawyers at the highest levels of government? I agree that we should get away from that. But we have no examples to look at that suggest that good or even mediocre business people make good presidents. That's number one. But there's a second layer here, which is that although the economy historically does better under Democratic presidents, that's not my opinion. Run the numbers yourselves, either looking at unemployment or the stock market, however you want to reasonably measure it, look at it yourself. Polls show that Republicans are more trusted on the economy. Now, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, Paul Krugman reminds us, it's not even clear how great a business person Trump is. This is from Paul Krugman's article. Remember, too, that Mr. Trump is a clear case of someone born on third base who imagines that he hit a triple. He inherited a fortune, and it's far from clear that he has expanded that fortune any more than he would have if he had simply parked the money in an index fund. We discussed that, Lewis, which is if Trump had just parked his inheritance and collected what the stock market would have provided since that time, he'd have more or less the same amount of money, depending on how much money you believe he has, which we don't really know. So here's what we have. It is multi-layered. Let's put the list up, Lewis, for people in terms of Trump being a danger to the U.S. Number one is this idea that Republicans are better for the economy. That's demonstrably false. It's false. We've looked at it a number of times. Then we have the idea that good business people make good presidents. Maybe it can be true, but we have no evidence to support that idea. And then we have the narrative around Trump, which is that Donald Trump is a good businessman. That's demonstrably false in that he's done nothing with his inheritance that he couldn't have done simply by hanging around, drinking whatever it is he likes to drink, and letting the money accrue in index funds. So it isn't clear if Donald Trump thought he could be president at the beginning of this horrible experiment. But at this point, he must believe, Lewis, at least to some extent, that he could probably do this job. And that's the real danger and nightmare here.
Without a doubt. I'm quite certain Donald Trump thinks that he could do just about anything. He's very, very confident, a very confident guy. And still, a president does have to hire a cabinet. You have to have your cabinet, you have your administration, you have your advisors, you have all of that stuff.
I'm glad you bring that up.
Are they going to let Donald Trump just do whatever he wants?
Well, Donald Trump's claim all along has been, when I don't know, I'm going to hire the best people. The best people was going to be Donald Trump's saving grace from the fact that he doesn't know that much. Meanwhile, we saw him hire Ben Carson to help him find a vice president. That didn't last too long. And I'll remind you of one name, Healy Baumgardner. Look her up and see if there's any evidence that Trump is actually going to hire good people. So I think that the specifically on the economy, the idea that Trump is going to save the economy is ridiculous. Most of the things he says he would do can't be done, or he was part of the problem in creating, including sending jobs, which now no longer exist, to Mexico and China. It is a horror show, ladies and gentlemen, and Paul Krugman doing a good job of pointing this out. Okay, there's a story that has made big headlines over the Memorial Day weekend, and I want to break it down and try to reduce hysteria a little bit, but still tell you what the dangers are and what's going on. For many years, I've been talking about a sort of upcoming problem in the world of medicine, and this is resistance to antibiotics. Antibiotics, like vaccines, have been hugely important in medicine. The number of lives saved by antibiotics is huge. And you sometimes hear doctors say it's better to wait before taking antibiotics to make sure you really need them. Because number one, if you're taking antibiotics for a virus, they don't do anything. And taking antibiotics too much can increase your resistance to antibiotics, which over the long term can make them less effective. For a while, I was getting a lot of sinus infections, Lewis, which did require antibiotics to the extent that they were, in many of those cases, bacterial. But my doctor would always suggest, if it's not too uncomfortable, wait a few days, because if it does start going away on its own and you avoid taking antibiotics, that's a really good thing. Good advice. The other side of this is bacteria that are antibiotic resistant. And an antibiotic resistant strain of bacteria was found in the urine of a 49-year-old Pennsylvania woman. Some normal antibiotics were used, and then colistin was used, which is considered a sort of antibiotic of last resort, especially for some dangerous superbugs, which can end up killing up to 50% of infected patients. And the bacteria, it was an E. coli strain, was resistant to this antibiotic of last resort. So the headlines, Lewis, were, it's here, it's happening, we have antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It's true that the bacteria was specifically resistant to colistin, but doctors are still saying, we have other antibiotics we haven't yet tried, which more than likely are going to handle this. So there was some hysteria about this, but the reality is this was found in the urine of one 49-year-old patient. That particular antibiotic didn't work, but there is still every indication that others will work. So the headlines were overblown, but it is still true that this is the first time in the US that we have seen colistin-resistant strains of bacteria in a person in the United States. So this is still a big deal, okay? Here is a quote from CDC Director Tom Frieden. It basically shows us that the end of the road isn't very far away for antibiotics, that we may be in a situation where we have patients in our intensive care units or patients getting urinary tract infections for which we do not have antibiotics. So you might say, well, hold on a second, David. There's tons of types of antibiotics. I can think of 20 or 30 or 40 off the top of my head. That's true, but the problem is there aren't that many kinds of antibiotics. There are many brands, but within that there are just a few families. And that's where the problem is. Types of antibiotics are actually quite limited. You have your penicillins. Amoxicillin is a common one kids sometimes get for strep throat or adults. You have cephalosporins. You have your macrolides. Zithromax is a common one that people might recognize from that. You've got your fluoroquinolones, including Cipro and Levaquin, which are common ones. You have your sulfonamides and your tetracyclines and your aminoglycosides. But that's really it. And oftentimes when people, number one, are intolerant to one within a family, they can be intolerant to others within that family. And when a bacteria or an individual build resistance to one within a family, they can also be resistant to others within that family. So this is something we've been talking about for years, Lewis. This is an upcoming issue. This particular story, we shouldn't be all losing it just over that.
We don't need to freak out now, but this is
we should be ready to freak out.
Huge problem, yeah. There's a ton of resources being dedicated to trying to solve this problem, either
no doubt.
developing new antibiotics or alternative treatment methods. And the day when we do have to freak out is relatively quickly approaching.
Well, it depends who you talk to, right? Some people say that within 5 to 10 years that this may be a real and present and actual danger. Others say, I've read as much as 50 years away, but this is not the type of thing we want to wait on, is it?
No, not at all. And a urinary tract infection was mentioned. That is something that can kill you if not treated, and it's a very common thing as well.
All right, I'm on Twitter at dpacman. Lewis is on Twitter at lewismotamedy. What a show. Great to be back from the long weekend.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is David Tyler. David, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. David gets access to the bonus show for members only, the commercial-free audio and video feeds of the show, invitations to the members-only town halls, and so many other things. But most importantly, he's supporting alternatives to corporate media. That's really the important thing. That's really the big point of membership. But we also make it interesting with a lot of great member benefits, most of which you can sample at davidpakman.com/membership. All right, Lewis, I had last week I told on the bonus show a big story of a power loss at my apartment here in Boston, and it revealed how incredibly unprepared I am for the power loss. And I actually put on my Instagram feed, which is at david.pakman, a picture of the Eversource trucks showing up and doing work. And this is the second most popular picture on my Instagram feed over the last week. And the number of people who commented after our story about how I wasn't even properly prepared with ice packs to keep food cold in the fridge as the fridge temperature trickled up and up and up. The entire weekend was spent, Lewis, not the entire weekend, but a lot of the weekend researching what needs to be in my prepper kit. And I think I'm going to start doing some slight prepping for this.
Yeah, it's really not as big a deal as when you lose power in winter. That is something that is much more dangerous. And so while it's annoying to lose food and stuff like that, you're not going to die while sleeping in your apartment.
No, you're right about that.
Condo, I should say, excuse me.
Yes, well, it's all the same. I mean, it's in a, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so that's the second most popular picture on my Instagram feed, which now has over 2,000 followers, I will mention, at david.pakman on Instagram. And then, Lewis, this picture, people loving this picture. And I have to say, the detail on it is quite stunning. We went hiking over the weekend, Lewis, in Western Massachusetts. And I came across a millipede, and I took a picture. This is my new phone, my Samsung S7. The detail on this picture, I don't know what I'm doing, Lewis. It's quite stunning, the level of detail that you can see here.
It really is. My phone, actually, the camera on it doesn't even work right now. That's a software issue.
Sure.
But when it does, it's really not that great a camera. The phone is great. Everything's great except the camera. I do wish it had a better camera on it.
I posted this picture of this huge millipede to Instagram, and then people started yelling at me to leave it alone, that it's harmless. Number one, I wasn't planning on doing anything to this thing. I don't go around squishing bugs. That's number one. But number two, of course, I posted the picture much later. Like, I didn't post the picture and then wait around for 2 hours to figure out what it is I should do with this thing. So it was kind of funny, people saying, don't squish this thing. But someone wrote to me and said, David, these millipedes secrete a compound related to cyanide if you pick them up, and it smells really good like amaretto. I have no clue if that's true. I've deliberately not looked that up to just mention it on the show. Could that possibly be true, that these millipedes smell like amaretto when you pick them up?
I'm quite certain that is true. I don't know if it's millipedes or certain caterpillars or what have you, but there definitely are creatures that do that, yes. Well,
fascinating stuff. Make sure to give me a follow on Instagram, david.pakman. Also on the web, instagram.com/david.pakman. I have a face swap I did with my dad, which I'm going to be posting today, which I predict, Lewis, next week is going to be probably the most liked picture on my Instagram. It's pretty funny.
I looked at it. It is quite funny, and for reasons that some old fans of the show might find humorous as well.
Really?
Yeah. Well, the Guatam thing.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll deal with that next week. Anyway, let's continue. I don't want to halt the progress of the show. Last week we did an experiment where we took calls. We called them live calls on the show, even though they were live in the sense that we just took them one after the other, and people were talking to me in a live sense. But of course, the show is recorded in the afternoon, so they weren't live in that they could be listened to as they were going on. In any case, it went really well. I mean, we turned it on, Lewis, at the designated time, and the calls just started rolling in, and we took calls for 10 or 12 minutes, and then we had to end it, and the calls just kept popping up.
They did, and so people were prepared. I was worried that no one would call at all. You know, it's in the middle of the day, it's the week,
Sure.
Who knows? But the bad thing is that you have to just keep trying to call if you want to get through.
Our system isn't as sophisticated yet to be able to put people in a hold queue.
Right. So it may be a little frustrating. You might get busy signals, but that's what you have to do. Yeah, but it worked for 3 people.
We dealt with a question about how libertarian Lewis and I are on different issues. We dealt with a question about child labor related to a story about Adidas that we did. And we had questions about our experiences with drug addicts. So it went so well, we're going to do it again. The number is 617-830-4750. This Thursday, 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time. That is when we are going to open the phone lines, Lewis. 617-830-4750. Any topics, any questions, it will be wide open. And I will mention, we do want some kind of graphic for the screen behind us, the screens behind us when we take calls. If you want to submit something, the only requirement is that it be 1920 by 1080 for a graphic that pops up behind us. It would also be cool if we could have another graphic created for a side-by-side. That is just a more vertical orientation. So like when I would talk to a guest, you see the guest in the split screen. We would want something for when we're taking calls in the split screen. I'm confident, Lewis, people in our audience have the skills to make this happen. I don't know that you do, but I think there are lots of people who watch or listen to the show who do.
Anytime we put in a request for such a graphic, people come through.
Yeah.
It's great.
Thursday, 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time, 617-830-4750. We will take live calls. Let me tell you a story about our buddy, Texas Congressman and former Judge Louis Gohmert, who once argued on the House floor that gay rights is wrong, and so is same-sex marriage, because if there was a gay island, everybody would die off. Impeccable logic, I know. He's now upping his game. He put together a sort of apocalyptic scenario to really put in perspective that members of the LGBT community are not worthy of respect. And he talked about whether we would have them in a space colony. Would we have gay people in a space colony if we had to do a sort of Noah's Ark selection of people for it? I know it doesn't really make much sense. I'll play it for you. Warning, I don't know that it'll make more sense after hearing from Louis Gohmert himself. Check it out.
I mean, I really wonder how many people in this body who had the ultimate power to decide whether humanity would go forward or not, whether it was an asteroid coming, something that would end humanity on Earth as dinosaurs were ended at one time. Okay, we've got a spaceship that can go, as Matt Damon did in the movie, plant a colony somewhere. We can have humans survive this terrible disaster about to befall. If you could decide what 40 people you put on the spacecraft that would save humanity,
Right.
how many of those would be same-sex couples? You're wanting to save humankind for posterity. Basically a modern-day Noah. You have that ability to be a modern-day Noah.
Sure.
You can preserve life. How many same-sex couples would you take from the animal kingdom and from humans to put on a spacecraft to perpetuate humanity and the wildlife kingdom?
Right.
That's why It's been called part of the natural law, natural law given by the Creator.
This is the Congress of the United States, and there's a conversation about how many gay couples or people you would put on a mission to the stars to avoid an asteroid apocalypse. It's beyond sad that this lunatic is an elected official in a country with the most powerful military on the planet. The real question is, how many religious nuts would you put on that mission to the stars to save humanity? And the answer is 0, because they would only be an impediment to making the decisions that would preserve humanity's existence.
Correct, yeah. Now, I know what Louis is saying here.
Do you?
And I'm embarrassed that I share a name with this guy.
Which is that two gay people cannot reproduce.
But we do have ways of ensuring that a woman who might be gay has a baby, right?
Yes.
We can do that.
Right. I mean, in other words, a gay man can still fertilize an egg, and a lesbian woman can still birth a child, no matter what her sexual preferences are. This is crazy, okay? I mean, the real...
Also, hold on, let me just add one thing. These couples, these straight couples that go into space,
yeah,
he makes it sound as if they won't have gay children ever.
right? Yeah, because, by the way, gay kids are being born to straight couples all the time. Here's the new mantra for people like Louis Gohmert and his space colonies, for the people pushing the trans bathroom laws. This is how I boil it down. Let's come up with offensive and discriminatory solutions to problems we do not have. That, I think, is the most succinct way of sort of summarizing what it is we're seeing here. We have the Zika virus. We have colistin-resistant E. coli, as I told you earlier in the show. And Louis Gohmert is talking about gay people on space colonies. And there's a real lesson here, which is don't huff glue.
Yeah. Let's let the companies and organizations that are sending the craft to Mars decide who to put on it. And let's not let Louis Gohmert get involved in that.
There is actually the issue of sexuality in future human space colonies has actually been written about quite a bit, and it's discussed in the context of population control. When you have physically limited space like you might in a space colony or future spacefaring population, I believe that in The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, we actually interviewed him. He's one of my favorite sci-fi writers, and it was great to interview him. The idea is, in a future society where you have very limited space, what if you were to basically make everybody gay, imagining that you could with a pill or an injection, right? Just hypothetically, this is speculative fiction. You store eggs and sperm, and then you make everybody gay, right? So you don't have to worry about birth control. You don't have to worry about accidental kids being born or whatever. And then it becomes one in, one out. When someone dies, then you fertilize an egg with the saved sperm, and you sort of grow a kid in an embryo. Very speculative fiction. I totally get it. But the idea of homosexuality as a solution to population control issues has actually been written about extensively. So obviously Gohmert is completely off his rocker. This is a waste of time in the House of Representatives. But interestingly enough, if you want to open up this door to talking about the preservation of the species if we have to leave Earth, most of the speculation is on the opposite side of what Louis Gohmert is saying.
That is true. And I'll add one more thing about his little speech.
Yeah.
He actually acknowledges that dinosaurs lived a long time ago and were wiped out.
Silver lining.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, always good to find something positive in these rants. Make sure to give us a like on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show. We will take a break, and then we are going to talk about something we haven't often discussed on this show, the afterlife.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Matthew O'Neill, who is a Biblical Studies Ph.D. student and teacher. He has a master's degree in theology from St. Michael's College, and he's a certified Humanist chaplain, also author of What the Bible Really Does and Doesn't Say About Sex, Afterlife. He also writes for the Anthropology blog through the Patheos Network. It's so great to have you on. I want to start with sort of at the base level. How far back do ideas of an afterlife go? I mean, we know currently they span many religions in sort of different forms, but how far back can we trace the concept of an afterlife?
The furthest back that we can date, I mean, we can make rough estimates as to probably back dawning around the time that humanity first started speaking and having some form of ability to communicate with one another. But in terms of a tangible form in written form and in stories that we're told, I mean, we have concepts dating back probably as late as 3 to 4 thousand years ago, and probably later too. I mean, I'm sure there's images in archaeology sites that they found instances where there's probably some type of communication around the afterlife. But yeah, I mean, it dates relatively far back.
What are some of the common themes that exist across different cultures, religions, etc., with regard to an afterlife? I mean, are there certain particular characteristics that we can assess that and say these themes seem to regularly come up, or in a plurality of cases come up when a culture or religion hypothesizes about the afterlife?
I mean, I think the only real overwhelmingly continuous theme that goes through all of them is this idea of the continuation of the consciousness or some type of variation of the soul. I mean, for example, if you study Judaism right before the Hellenization, before the Greco-Roman influence came in, there was still this concept that the mind somehow still continued on after the body expired. The earliest ideas that Judaism has in terms of an afterlife just involves the soul, but the soul being or some type of consciousness, but separate from the body, separate from the deity, separate from any sort of even the idea of a punishment or reward system in the afterlife. We have instances of people talking about going to rejoin their ancestors and things like that, but once those other more powerful influences, like the Greco-Roman ones, when Alexander the Great came through and brought that influence through the eastern part of the known world at that point, that's when things started coming about, where there was this idea of a community sort of coming together, early stages of ideas of reward and punishment in the afterlife. So really, the only real consistent thing that we have is just some form of identity or consciousness, a continuation of yourself beyond your earthly body's demise.
I'd love to get into a conversation about sort of what the practical implications would be to life on Earth, right? The present life, if there were an afterlife. And this is not so much a conversation about whether you or anybody else or me or whoever believes that there is an afterlife, but sort of what would be the implications. And we often, when we talk about, at least in the context of right-wing evangelical Christianity and some other extremist elements of religions today, we see that oftentimes a more progressive approach or point of view would say, you know, sometimes the belief in an afterlife in extremist 2016 circles leads to actions that we may not consider that beneficial or positive or good today based on the understanding or belief, rather, that there is an afterlife. I'd love to hear your take on that, right? I mean, what's the best way to start getting into how we assess how a potential afterlife affects how people, the responsibilities and duties and moral obligations people feel today?
Sure. I was sort of thinking about this not too long ago, only like a day or so ago. And what actually led me to sort of thinking about it is, if we talk about things like a very real and scary concept right now is the idea of global warming and the idea of the catastrophes that could come to our planet if we don't start taking more progressive actions towards using more fuel efficient cars, by using renewable energies and things like that. If you think about it in terms of behavior that's exhibited today, I mean, it differs from religion to religion. It differs from sect of each religion to different sect. But if you look at people like the Westboro Baptist Church, who go in and protest outside of funerals, who protest outside of other rallies, who say these what we consider really awful things. I mean, they do it because they from what I understand through admittedly secondhand or sometimes even third-hand sources, that the Westboro Baptist Church really fear that there's going to be this eternal punishment of doom and fire and eternal suffering if they don't do the things that they do. Likewise, our generation, or the people that are certainly more conscious and more forward, I don't want to say forward thinking, but are more proactive in making sure that they are making these healthier choices, that they are using renewable energies and things like that, they're recycling and all that. They're doing it because they fear that if they don't, their children might suffer, that there's going to be all these negative consequences in terms of wildlife, extinctions, water levels rising, and things like that. So I guess I would frame it sort of in that way, where people who are of a more religious mindset, while maybe they personalize it a little bit more, do think that there's going to be some real significant, powerful consequences for their behaviors, particularly in the afterlife, if they don't take certain measures here today. And we see that, again, in the Westboro Baptist Church. We see it in the more extreme groups like ISIS, who do things like honor killings, where they will execute a member of their family because they have done a certain thing that not only brings shame to them, but shame to their family, shame to their community. So it's almost sort of a parallel type of situation, like what people who, like I said, are more conscious about the global warming situation do.
There are some common themes that we hear, stories that are told in society about so-called near-death experiences, stories of a so-called light at the end of the tunnel. And sometimes the fact that we hear similar stories about these incidents from people of different religious faiths, sometimes that's used to sort of point and say, hey, look, there must be something to this if we are hearing similar stories from people with different religious backgrounds. What does science, or what do sort of more empirical or evidence-based analyses of these stories that have accumulated over time tell us about a supposed afterlife? Can we draw anything from where those stories often coincide, or can we not?
We can draw certain things from them. They're just not supernatural things that we can draw from them. So what's really interesting about the near-death experience is, you're right, there's a lot of very, very common elements to them. Doesn't matter what part of the world they're from, what sort of religion they grew up in. I mean, the only thing that really differs is maybe some of the types of visions that they see, the people that they might see, if they see a deity or a significant religious figure. Yes, that'll differ from culture to culture, but it has been noted, like you said, that there's a lot of parallels in all these accounts. But we can replicate all of those different situations in scientific experiments, either by accident or not. As one example, the light at the end of the tunnel situation, they've actually been able to replicate that in, interestingly enough, in these machines that they put pilots in to do like test flight simulations before they put them into an actual plane. And what they've discovered is it's the blood draining from the eyes when they start hitting those high altitudes and those very fast velocities, and they can actually prevent that from happening simply by putting goggles over the pilot's eyes. So it's something that, again, they're able to replicate, they're able to understand how it works, and they're able to actually even prevent it simply by doing one small thing, which is put goggles over the eyes. In other situations like the out-of-body experiences, they've been able to replicate that simply by putting electrodes in a certain region of the brain. And when they set that off, the clients who have been part of these studies have said, oh gosh, I felt like, and I saw myself floating out of my body. So they're able to replicate all these things. And it's more important to note that a lot of neurologists and a lot of people who are focused and working in this particular area of neurobiology, like Oliver Sacks and even Sam Harris, have noted that these instances where these people experience these things, not only can they be replicated, but they very frequently don't happen when the brain has been turned off, but in fact when it's been turned back on, and your brain becomes hyperactive and it starts picking up all the activity it lacked a moment ago. And it only lasts for maybe 20 or 30 seconds, but the experience just feels much longer, similarly to when we are in our REM sleep cycle and when we have those dreams. I mean, It's not to say our brain shuts off and comes back on, but it's only for a very brief period of time, but we experience it as being much longer. So again, there's a lot we can take away from it. It's just not within the context of anything supernatural.
Well, it is absolutely fascinating, and I know that we are going to get a lot of emails on this issue because so many people, as you say, when they have a personal experience with this, there is really no way to say, hey, here is, or it's difficult often to say, here's the medical or scientific explanation for what happened. These are such deeply personal experiences for so many people. I'll remind everybody, we've been speaking with Matthew O'Neill, who is a biblical studies Ph.D. student and teacher. He has a master's in theology from St. Michael's College, is a certified humanist chaplain, and is also author of the books What the Bible Really Does and Doesn't Say About Sex and the book Afterlife. Matthew, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I admit that I am not a fan of Delta Airlines. They are hugely anti-union, so much so that there's actually been federal investigations into their practices a couple of years ago. I haven't flown Delta in, I don't know, probably 10 years, 15 years. I can't remember the last time I flew Delta. I just don't do it. Fortunately, based on where I live and have lived, it hasn't really been a huge inconvenience not to fly Delta. But they've done something pretty interesting. At a relatively low cost, Delta has reorganized some TSA screening lanes at its hub airport of Atlanta, Georgia, and the results have been fantastic. Now, the big picture is still that the TSA is a disaster. It's mostly security theater. Last year, I told you that 95% of banned objects were not caught by TSA agents during a big test that was done to see how good the TSA was. At the micro level, the TSA is so inefficient that these huge bottlenecks are created. And aside from the issues that are going on now in terms of staffing and lane closures, this is a real problem. You see slow people, Lewis, cause these huge bottlenecks at the TSA security lines. So in Atlanta, Delta made a few changes that hugely improved efficiency. Let's look at what those changes are. Number one, they started using conveyor belts instead of agents to bring those empty trays back to where the line begins. You might be used to seeing that when there's no trays left for you to put your stuff into, a TSA agent has to physically pick up and collect these trays and walk them back to the beginning of the line. Now they've set up conveyor belts in a few lanes in the Atlanta Delta terminal to speed that up. They've also set up 5 what they're calling divestment points where travelers can drop bags and move on. You'll often see that there's someone, often an inexperienced traveler, somebody maybe with a bunch of kids or who knows what. They take much longer to take their laptop out of their bag, presuming you don't have TSA pre-check or whatever. And it holds up a number of people who are basically holding in their hands everything they need to drop off in the bin, and it slows down the progress. So what they've done is set up the trays at 5 different points. So if there's someone at the front of the line holding up the line and you're 10 people back, there might be a spot there for you to put all your stuff in the tray. And then you can skip everybody who is still working on putting their stuff in a tray and go through either the porno scanner or the metal detector. This has also sped up the process. And then number 3, they've now set up an automated system. So normally when a bin or an item gets flagged and it needs to be inspected, it stays in the same line on the same conveyor belt. They separated it so that when an item now gets flagged, it's diverted to another area and you can keep progress going for the bins and the luggage that don't need to be scanned. So those are the 3 changes they made, and it has had a drastic impact, Lewis. Now, the funniest thing about reading about all this is the entire system was and is so outdated that conveyor belts, a technology that first appeared in 1892 in its first form, was introduced and drastically sped up the process. A 19th century technology, Lewis, is what was added to the TSA to make it more efficient.
Yes, but this isn't going to solve the problem overall, right?
Of course
this
not.
is an improvement. The problem is, well, there are a number of problems. The big problem is we just haven't allocated the resources we need to make sure that this happens more quickly and that it's more efficient. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, and sometimes it's a question of financial incentive, right? Delta makes money through efficiency. If people start missing flights by the tens of thousands, as we've seen happen in some places, the airlines now have to rebook people. It's a nightmare for the airlines. The TSA makes their living hosting security theater. They don't have the same incentive to care about efficiency beyond the fact that legislators could get really angry and tell them to get it together. Delta's income depends on doing this. So no surprise that some relatively simple changes made a drastic difference. I don't know what to tell you. The entire thing is just a total disaster.
It is, yeah. As long as we are going to have this crappy security system, let's at least maybe take some money out of other types of defense spending,
right,
and put it into this so that people can get where they need to go.
Failed Republican presidential candidate Marco Rubio has announced he is now supporting Donald Trump. This is absolutely fantastic. And while he says he doesn't agree that Mexicans are by and large rapists, he gives Trump credit for saying that because it was really effective. Remember that Marco Rubio has insulted everything about Donald Trump, from his supposedly small hands to the fact that he'll make America orange again rather than great, to criticizing Trump's spelling in tweets, to Trump's hair. I mean, everything has been insulted on Donald Trump by Marco Rubio. But since then, Rubio says he regrets the insults and actually he is supporting Trump. And here's where we get to the good stuff. Over the weekend, during an interview on CNN State of the Union, Marco Rubio said that Trump was being supported by some scary dudes, but that he doesn't actually believe Trump is a white nationalist. Let's take a look at that clip first.
The rest, of course, from there snowballed. Donald Trump has gotten a lot of support from a lot of good, God-fearing Americans. He's also gotten a lot of support from some pretty scary dudes. The white nationalists out there and the like. Before some of the primaries, some of these hate groups did robocalls on his behalf, make sure to elect Donald Trump and not the Cubans. Did you ever hear about that stuff?
I did. It's offensive, not just against me, but the fact that elements like that are still involved in American politics. And traditionally, a candidate would disavow that and say, I want nothing to do with it. I don't want them as part of my campaign. And
he didn't.
He didn't, and I didn't like that, and I said that at the time, and, it is what it is. Obviously, I don't believe that Donald Trump's a white nationalist. I don't believe that those are his views. But I do think it's unfortunate that people like that have found the ability to express themselves in this way in a campaign, and that, I didn't like it, but if it wasn't against me, I wouldn't have liked it. I just don't really think there's a place for that in our party or in our country.
How is that an explanation? It is what it is. Yeah, I wanted him to disavow the insane racist nativists who were going around saying don't vote for the Cubans, but he didn't. And you know what? It is what it is, and I still support the guy. I like his policy on, banning Muslims? I have no idea.
What do you think, Marco Rubio VP?
Yeah, I mean, people are speculating what was he promised in order to do this. And then here's where we really get into the meat of it. I love this. Rubio says it was really great strategy to call Mexicans rapists because it really put the other candidates in a tough position. Check this out. This is crazy.
In his first speech announcing his candidacy, he described the Mexicans coming over the border as rapists and drug dealers.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Did it personally offend you? I know you're not Mexican, but you are Latino.
Yeah, no, it's an offensive comment. I mean, there's no doubt about it. That's an offensive comment, and by the way, highly inaccurate.
Yeah.
But here's the trap you're in, right? If you respond to it, he's getting what he wants. I mean, that's why he's sometimes saying this, to dominate the cycle. I mean, I don't give him credit for what he said, but I give him credit for the way he understands this stuff. I mean, Donald Trump, we underestimated how well he understood how the media, and I don't mean this, it's very common for political people to attack media people, but it's just the way it is. Media's a business.
This is less of a critique of Marco Rubio. I mean, he's actually right that it was interesting and intelligent in the sense that it put everybody else in a really awkward position, but it's more of an exposure of how absurd this entire Republican campaign has been. And I'd go even further. Trump knew not only how the media would react, but Trump knew how the racist and nativist elements of the Republican Party and the right-wing electorate would react. That's the part Rubio is less eager to admit. Rubio is saying, hey, The media reacted in a very particular way to Trump saying that, and that's why, even though I don't agree with it, it's a credit to him. But it also was the Republican electorate reacting in a particular way, and Rubio doesn't want to admit that, obviously.
No. And why are you in this party, Rubio? This is your party. You don't like it. Well, maybe you should just leave politics forever.
Conflicting opinion from Republican insiders, though, about whether Rubio's career in politics is over. On the one hand, his presidential campaign was such an embarrassing farce that he got destroyed in his own state. On the other hand, his state is Florida, and very odd things happen in Florida.
Florida is the strangest state in the country. I'm putting it nicely. It's a wild, wacky state.
And you lived there many years.
I lived there, well, yeah. I was young for 3 of those years. I was quite young, but close to 2 of those years, a bit older. Yeah.
We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail I received from a Trump supporter who really doesn't like Hillary.
Listen, Americans and Christians, Hillary Clinton is Lucifer in the skies, and Obama's her Antichrist partner. If the Christians don't get Donald Trump as president, the Christians is dead. America's going to burn. Put Donald Trump in there as president. Get rid of Lucifer and his sidekick, Obama. Get rid of their policies. Or the Christians of this country, America is doomed.
Presented without comment. On today's bonus show, modern day chimeras and bioethics. We will also talk about the world's worst commute to school. You know that thing about I used to have to go uphill both ways in the snow? That's obviously not physically possible, but we have some information on the world's worst commute to school. Also, lionfish. What is it? Why is Whole Foods selling it? And how overpriced will it be? Those stories and more on today's bonus show. Sign up at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.